This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And we are back. Art of Darkness, podcast about the dark side of creativity. This is a special Dark Room episode. If you haven't listened to a Dark Room episode before, what we do is we have our core episodes where we go in depth multiple hours on a subject, and then in the Dark Room we bring on somebody who has some insight into one or more of those figures, in this case more, and helps us kind of flesh out our ideas about this figure or these figures. Helps us develop them. You get it? We gotta do puns, just to keep things lively. But first, before we get into that, Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, Brad. I went and saw a condo here downtown, and then I went and saw another one. I need an office. I need a studio space.
Yeah.
And I went to see a second one, and on the 26th floor, and the realtor pulled out his phone to take a picture, and his earpods went flying.
Off the balcony,
all the way down.
Wow,
and I'm like,
okay,
it's easy. Just use the Find My Device.
Right.
It's down there somewhere.
Sure. Yeah.
He sent me a picture, and they were demolished.
But
I am doing great. We just had an interview that you and I did with X-Ray Literary Magazine. That just came out. So check that out. You go to artofdarkpod.com. I have my new radio play in 2 parts that is coming out. Part 1 is already out. It's called Basilisk. It's a very online, very strange Lovecraftian, neo-Lovecraftian AI radio horror based on the very Reddit thought experiment of Rocco's Basilisk. If you listen to Art of Darkness, you're probably going to appreciate that. There's a link on artofdarkpod.com. You click back, you can find it. Or you just go on Spotify and look up Dark Pony Radio. It's there. It's called Basilisk. Part 1, Eternal September. Part 2, The King's Pact, is coming soon, so I'm excited about that. And then tickets are on sale for our live show in October.
That's correct.
Detroit, Michigan. Yeah. I can't wait. We're gonna have a Halloween party.
Yeah, it's gonna be great. We're gonna have a Halloween party. We're gonna talk about the spooky ooky death of Harry Houdini. We're gonna make friends. Maybe hopefully not lose any friends. We're gonna make some fun times out there in the real world. So definitely come join us. You can find a link to tickets there, and you're not only helping support the show, you're also helping to support an independent theater institution in Detroit. They've been there for a long time, and Kevin, as I'm sure you can attest, trying to run a theater in 2024, there's it's tricky. It's got its challenges. So we're happy to be working with Planet Ant on that. It's going to be very exciting.
This is a party. We are throwing an Art of Darkness live. It's going to be a live recording of the death of Harry Houdini. We're going to have an opener where Job Bluth is opening for us. We demand to be taken seriously as the Podcasters Union. But it's going to be a lot of fun, and people are encouraged to dress up. If you want to do a Halloween dress up thing, that's fun. If not, just come as you are. But there will be some costumes. We are going to have a lot of fun, and this is the only live show we're doing this year. So if you want to, if you're an MK Ultra, if you're an MK Ultra victim, if you're an Art of Darkness Ultra, MK Ultra, Art of Darkness Ultra victim fan,
and if you're both, slide into the DMs. We might want to talk to you.
Yeah, we want some inside information. I want to know what Brad's triggers are. But really, this is like our meetup, right? This is the shot you got. So come on down. It's going to be fun. Detroit. I think it's the Paris. Detroit is the Paris of the Midwest.
Yeah, people were saying that. I'm not sure if they still say that, but yeah. I take your meaning.
I said it. Anyway, it's going to be in October 26th.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. Appreciate that. Yeah, and we hope to see some of you there. Let's get into the meat of the show. We have today we're talking a bit about two subjects of popular episodes we've done, Andrei Tarkovsky and Yukio Mishima. And we're bringing back a good friend and a very, very, very talented writer, uh, David Leo Rice, who has recently published a book called The Berlin Wall, which we're going to talk about as well. I'm very excited to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit on that. David, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we talked, gosh, was it a year? It was a year ago or more, talking Lovecraft and Faulkner, which was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. So we're very happy to have you back. So you just recently, in May, I believe, published The Berlin Wall, out now on Whiskey Tit. You can buy this Amazon, wherever. What's the best place for someone to buy it in terms of supporting you and Whiskey Tit? Is there...
Best is probably directly from them. So if you just go to whiskeytit.com or .org, but just Google Whiskey Tit shop,
yeah.
you could order it from them. You could do bookshop.org. They're always good. Barnes and Noble. Honestly, Amazon, it doesn't support us as much, but it gets you the book, and that,
Right.
At some level, that's the point, right? So,
yeah.
I wouldn't turn that down. And I guess maybe the very best thing is to request it at a bookstore. To go in and ask if they have it, and they might, and if they don't, ask them to order it. Because that makes them aware of it, and that's probably the number one thing to do.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Excellent. I love this. I don't know if it's the slug line, but I'm looking at her website, and the sort of one sentence description of it is very, very, very compelling. Europe 2020. Some claim that the Berlin Wall, once a living entity, is coming back together, its scattered pieces seeking reunion on the far side of history. And that gives me a little goosebumps. If the objective of that bid is to get somebody engaged in it, I think you knocked that out of the park. Tell us a little bit about I guess, how do you, in addition to that, how do you flesh out that description? If somebody said, "Oh, what'd you write? What is this book?" Tell us a little bit about
it. Flesh is a good place to start. I mean, it's sort of the idea that, like it says, some people believe the Berlin Wall was a conscious, sentient entity, and then when it was broken apart in '89, the pieces became basically people, right? They became these kind of wandering, chopped up, flesh-covered beings that are sort of part cement and wire and graffiti and all of that, and part flesh. That in terms of like the action of the book, it takes place now or in 2020, and I actually wrote it in 2018, so it was kind of a near future speculative book, and then I was just editing it and sending it around, and so it finally came out now, which makes it a work of like near-term revisionist history. There's no COVID or any of the other 2020 stuff. But I think in a way that's fitting, because the book is about revisionist history, and it's about, in a way, it's not even really about the wall, but the wall is like a symptom of some larger problem, which is like reality itself fragmenting. So there are numerous characters in the book. There are consistent characters, but it's told in fragments, in kind of short sections that jump around and that leave a lot out, or at least give the suggestion that even bigger things are happening off stage, and a lot of what you can perceive through the novel is sort of what you do or don't believe based on claims that are made about what's happening. But there's no, one way to put it is like, there's no omniscient narrator, it's just every shard speaking for itself. Or another way to put it is, I almost thought of the narrator like is YouTube. There is this kind of omniscient narrator that just like could tell you everything, but you have no idea if it's neutral, or if it's like pushing some agenda, or if it's leaving things out, or if it's saying things that just aren't true. So I wanted to play with that idea a lot of, what does it mean in 2020 to be immersed in history? And then what does it mean to try to escape from it? And that's kind of the driving idea among the human characters too, but also among the wall, is like all of these people, or all of these factions and groups, want to rebuild the wall for their own purposes. Either they want to deny that the wall was ever alive and have it be dead and buried, or they want to rebuild it for these various kind of like fanatical schemes.
Okay.
But the wall itself wants to escape all that. This can take us toward the Tarkovsky world, but they want to like find some place deep in Russia beyond the eye of history, or at least they have this fantasy that, you know, their deep origins is like somewhere out in Siberia, beyond the reach of Germany and beyond the reach of the kind of political centers of Russia. And if only they could get there, they could like die in peace. You know, they could overcome being a pawn in anyone else's game. But of course, you know, whether or not that's possible is a very open question in the book.
Oh, well, I mean, that resonates with, I think the sentiment of some of us who have been living online since 2018 or before, you know, spending a lot of time on it. There is an aspect of like, there's got to be something outside of this, beyond it, that's not seen by it, not surveilled by it, right? Not a part of it in some way. And yet, you know, I feel like the question increasingly is there? Like, maybe there was in 2012 or something, but in 2024, is there a spot outside of it? It feels harder and harder to see or get your hands on, which is unsettling to say the least. But I suppose
the book raises the question of, is the internet itself the place where things are happening? You know, it's like the internet's story about itself is that it's reporting what's happening, right? Or it's like a repository of experience. And you could say this is real, you know, this happened or didn't happen based on something external. But I think like you said, you know, the book is really about the idea that might be becoming a kind of wishful thinking, and that really the internet just is the site of action. And yet it's always this kind of quasi meta space in which there's never only one level. You know, so it's like occurrence and reportage of occurrence and commentary of occurrence, and, you know, takes on the commentary on the commentary on the occurrence are like infinitely collapsed together, but there might be no escape from it. Or maybe there's this simmering terror that it can only hold so much, you know, like some idea that there's got to be a breaking point. At some point, it becomes real. And yet we both hope for that to happen, right? We both say, you know, I wish this would just break down and we would return to real life. And I think we fear what that would look like. Like, what if all the demons of the internet were released at once, right? That's a terrifying thought.
Right. Yeah, there's something of the post-apocalyptic or the apocalyptic fantasy, which is really a mirror image of the utopian fantasy, to my mind, right? Where it's like, you know, you start feeling so unsettled about the conditions. You want the world to end somehow because you assume, well, it would have to be better somehow if this were to all come crashing down. And you have to think about that in terms of the actual online life. You know, if overnight it was all deleted, and all of your accounts were, you know, everything was gone, it would be I think we'd all have an existential crisis, even as much as we're like, well, you know, Twitter's not real life, you know, the algorithm's not real, yada yada yada. If it all went away tomorrow, I think it would be I think we'd all have a crisis. I mean, I don't want to admit it, but I think I would, to some degree, you know.
Yeah, well, it's like if you live on poison, when you run out of poison, that's still a kind of death. It's still bad.
Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting. It sounds super compelling. You know, I know you've been doing a lot of activity. You've got a lot of recent interviews out there. X-Ray Lit, as we actually mentioned, just sort of coincidentally kind of coming out similar time frame as our interview with them. But also Dennis, you had a great interview on Dennis Cooper's blog, which was quite an interesting read, and I think people should go check that out. How are you feeling? You know, the one thing I kind of realized was you had this book come out. I thought, man, David is a super productive guy. Like, you crank it out. I mean, you've got no less than 6 books. Am I missing one? I know there's at least 6, right?
Let's see. I think there's 8.
Oh, okay.
As far as I know, if you include the Cronenberg anthology.
Okay. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, here's one thing that I think kind of ties into this Mishima conversation. I noticed in one of the interviews you were talking about, and your book, The Berlin Wall, I know kind of deals with characters leaning into fanaticism and potentially fascism for one reason or another. And you made this interesting point about a sort of internal fascism that, well, can you talk about that? Does this productivity come from, how much of it is just generativity, just ideas and coming up with stuff, and how much of it is you actually enforcing a rule on yourself, for lack of a better term?
I think it's always some combination, or like when things are working well, it's those two tendencies, which you could call like the more internally fascistic and internally playful, or more internally permissive, or you could call it, Apollonian and Dionysian, or sometimes I call it like the internal father and the internal child. But when those things are in harmony is when it's going well. So I think there's a positive desire, which is both that I just want to do, and even within the positive desire, there's it could bifurcate into like worldly ambition. I want to get my stuff out. I want to make something of myself, and then also maybe a more pure side of like, I just genuinely want to be in that world. Like I'm just excited about, dreaming well awake, as Murakami calls writing. So that, that's the positive side. That's the child who wants to play, or let's say the teenager who wants to go out into the world and make something of himself. The other side, though, is like the fascist dictator, or like the punishing father, which is there, I mean, I think in a way you have to be a little bit afraid of yourself, or you have to be afraid of like, what would happen if I didn't live up to my own standards? Mishima might be a good example of that, of an extreme. But I think there is, and it's a kind of like dangerous fuel to run on, A, because it might run out. You might just burn yourself out. And B, it's like calling the father's bluff, or calling the like prison warden's bluff. You don't want to find out either way, right? Like you don't want to transgress too much and find out that the threat isn't really serious and that actually you just let yourself slide. But you also don't want to transgress too much and find out the threat is dead serious and you kill yourself, right? Or severely punish yourself. So I try to not let that happen, which means staying one step ahead of it, which means, trying to be, within reason, but as productive as possible.
Yeah, no, I quite like that. It makes me think, I was thinking about that and thinking about that in terms of Mishima, and for people who listens to our episode going in depth on Mishima, and people who are familiar with his life and his work, I mean, he is up there for the most productive writers, I think. I would struggle to name a lot of writers who are more productive than he was. And apparently very little revision, apparently never missed a deadline, was, writing multiple projects at once and bringing them all to conclusion, sometimes down to the day that he said he was going to. And I have to admit, for me, there's a part of me, I'm similarly bifurcated about that. Part of me is like, oh, that's kind of crazy. And the other part of me is like, oh, how did he do that? I wonder, is there some way that I could do that? Right. Like, cause I feel like I work pretty hard, but I certainly don't have that level of productivity. And then it gets me thinking too about, how, as his life progressed, he increasingly became, there's complicated historical context to this, but he certainly leaned towards fascism, certainly nationalism. And it got me thinking that, I wonder sometimes, and you guys can tell me what you think of this, if this is kind of crazy. I mean, I wonder sometimes if an individual's drive, the appeal of fascism to an individual is looking for that order that they have not been able to impose on themselves. It's like this overcorrection. It's like, I'm not living up to something, and so the world must need more structure and order to it. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole like Hitler was a failed artist thing, but there is something to that, right? And the idea that, the word fascism is so radioactive today, partially because of the external manifestations that it has led to. And maybe so therefore you can make up a different word, but there's some inner impulse toward, not accepting no for an answer from yourself, right? And like insisting on a kind of inner discipline that I think can be a good thing, right? I think it becomes a bad thing when it's imposed on other people, right? And
Right.
that's all, a lot of people have said that about, political fascism, and it's definitely true of Mishima, is this obsession with public aesthetics, right? It's always obsessed with pageantry and uniforms and flags and anthems and
Mhm.
all this stuff that curdles into violence or even genocide when it imposes that on the aesthetics of the people. When it says, we want to kill all these people because we don't like how they look,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that becomes obviously something that has to be nipped in the bud way early. But in terms of art, I think it's necessary. And I think maybe having too much, like, we'll just see how it goes and kind of having too much of that means it won't go anywhere, right? It'll kind of
Mhm.
drift into nothing. So I think there's like an obsession with aesthetics as a kind of ethic can be really valuable in the realm of art,
Mhm.
And I think that leads me, like, one of the characters in the Berlin Wall is like this young Hungarian teenager who's obsessed with Mishima and is always reading patriotism, but in Hungarian, and has a similar uh, uncertainty that Mishima has about like what it means to be a hero,
Mhm.
and on the one hand, he feels like it's become impossible to be a hero, and he kind of looks towards some past golden age when, heroes were possible, which I think is always a fascist dream.
Mhm.
And yet at the same time, he kind of wonders, is being an artist or a writer or an intellectual, one way to put it is like, is it a kind of cowardice in that you're just retreating from the world and you're saying, I'm just going to like play with my idea? Are you just like a child playing with your toys as an adult? Or is it a kind of heroism where you say, I'm going to unrepress the things that otherwise have to be repressed in peacetime society, let's say, and there's
Mhm.
so much about Mishima, not being, I almost said cast for the war, which I think is actually right, but not being
Yeah.
drafted or not being able to go to war,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then casting himself at the end, right, making up a kind of pretend war that he could die in the last moment. And that totally
Right.
happens in the Berlin Wall also. But I think, to go back to the idea of the pressure you put on yourself as a writer, I don't know. It's something I really wrestle with and don't expect ever to resolve. But I feel like that
Mhm.
wrestling, like the friction of that wrestling, propels me onward, which is the question of, on the one hand, feeling a kind of shame of being like, well, I'm not really doing anything in the world. I'm just at home
Mhm.
playing with dreams and concepts. And, I'm like a kid just fantasizing or whatever.
Right.
But then also some sense that, like, believing in the value of your own inner life maybe is one of the most heroic things you can try to do, especially in a world like today where there isn't really a chance for external heroism and there's such tremendous pressure to crush your inner life or to mold your inner life into something totally predictable and interchangeable among like millions of people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And you know, Mishima had, I'm kind of just highlighting a point you already made. I mean, Mishima had his own towards the end, he continued writing, but I do think he began to distrust the value of doing it, of it being, it certainly wasn't enough for him, or he couldn't justify it to himself to be enough to create a meaningful life. For him, if he were going to make his life if his life was going to have full meaning, it didn't mean you just wrote a bunch of great books and died at 80. That somehow didn't um uh that wasn't enough for him to justify his suffering, or however you want to phrase it. And I think it does kind of, you think about, it makes me think about too. I sometimes enjoy, and I'm somebody who's dedicated a lot of time to writing too. It's something I get up every morning. I've given up career opportunities and things to maximize that time and try to do it. And yet I also sometimes um, I see this for some reason in poetry more than in other places, where poets will in their work, um, sort of arrogate characteristics to poetry that I'm not necessarily sure belong. Like, what is the famous line about being legislators of the universe, poets being legislators of the universe? And you'll see things like this occasionally, and I see that and I will wonder, is that like a attempt to make something more of poetry than it is, or is that what poetry is? I mean, how it is difficult sometimes to understand how important is this stuff, writing books? How important is it that there are a crop of new novels out there? And this is I'm kind of teasing what I want to talk about in the After Dark portion for our Patreon and Substack supporters at Art of Dark Pod. There's a recent article, and it's this is a consistent kind of meme that circulates about how white men, particularly straight men in this case, don't read novels. And it's an article sort of exploring that thing. And I thought, we're talking about Mishima, we're talking about Tarkovsky, who's not a novelist, but is a very serious artist,
and a huge
poet,
reader,
and a huge reader. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and a poet of sorts. We got three people here who read quite a bit. What's going on? Is that true? Are we just
I saw that article. I gave it up. I'm done.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll talk more about that. But it does get you thinking, like, well, if a huge proportion of people aren't engaging in it anymore, what has failed there, right? And we can talk about that later. Is it the books that have failed? Is it the culture that somehow failed? Are we in a time where it doesn't for some reason actually doesn't matter?
Well, this is going to be fun. We'll talk about this on the After Dark for our DOMs and our subs at Patreon and Substack.
Yeah.
But I'll throw a first volley and then we'll move on. But I just think, like, I don't think people can read anymore. I think there's an element of, like, people quite literally don't know how to read novels.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll leave it at that. We'll talk more.
Yeah. 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 I think it's interesting to investigate a little bit. But, back on, trying to say some things about Tarkovsky and Mishima, I did get thinking, David, we were, talking in the DMs about what we wanted to discuss in this episode. And I did get thinking about, there is, for some reason, you put those two guys next to each other and there is a resonance somehow. And I'm not entirely sure I understand it. And maybe we can all figure it out together. If there's a Venn diagram and Mishima and Tarkovsky are on it, what do you think is in the overlap?
Well, so they're both, to start just concretely and then get more philosophical, they're both related to the post-war era in their respective countries, or Japan and Russia, Soviet Union. Both reached a kind of high point in the 1960s. Tarkovsky was able to continue after that. Mishima certainly was not, but we're both doing great work in the 60s. And I think philosophically, we're both obsessed with this question that we've already touched on of, is there a transcendental aspect to art? And both of them had to do with these themes of, like, the artist versus society, or the artist's secular goals, whether it be for fame or money or status, juxtaposed or in conflict with their more transcendental goals. And I think they were both yearning for some higher plane within a really secularized time, right? Either the kind of militant secularism of communism, or I guess the alternate religion of communism, but Andrei Rublev, or Rubliov, as Russians say, is clearly a spiritual figure that Tarkovsky latched onto. And then Mishima, post-war Japan being this kind of just Americanizing, liberalizing sort of ancient culture that was rapidly being dragged into being a kind of junior partner in, like, a American empire, basically. Mishima, I think, was clearly a reactionary against that, but was also trying to embrace that. That's why he's interesting, right? That he's a sort of 60s counterculture figure, but almost, like we were saying before we started taping, like, so far right, he ends up on, maybe not on the left, but in some kind of, like, subversive, progressive wing of thought. And part of that has to do, I think, with now that tradition has been, in Japan's case, like, literally exploded, under the bombs, what is left that you could grasp at as an individual? And both of them are these kind of national figures, or at least are seen, we could talk about this too, are seen that way in the West, right? Both of them, I think, are popular in the West because they represent some kind of fantasy idea of what, to us, those exotic cultures are all about, which, I think may have been deliberately, not oversimplified, but accentuated in a very aestheticized way for the West, maybe. We can discuss that. But yeah, I mean, I think they have that in common. And I think they both, Tarkovsky seems like a less tortured person in some ways, or someone who was able to put his torments more fully into his work. And I don't know as much about his life, but he seemed like he was able to live a relatively stable life. But they both seem, yeah, that they were grasping for something more, or that they felt, something had happened in the war that changed both of their cultures probably forever, or at least for the rest of their lives, and they could see that early on, I think. And then the question is, what can you grasp at that might still be yours and that might take you to a higher plane, or at least can you write or film characters who are trying to do that.
Right, right. Yeah, that's that. I think that sums up quite a lot of it. And thank you for putting kind of a finer point on something that I has been somewhat inchoate for me. And you did hit on this notion of these being, uh, us looking at these people, I guess, through Western eyes. And, it's not that these are the only two figures who, non-Western figures who retain some popularity in the West, but there's certainly, um, I don't know if there's a lot of figures who are commonly talked about in English speaking countries from, say, the 60s or the 70s. There are plenty of people who don't who are not working in the English language that people are talking about a lot. But these two guys do seem to occupy a particular enduring kind of place. They somehow made it into the Western canon in a way that not a whole lot of other artists have. Um, and I kind of am curious, is there this sense of like, by looking at them and they're quote unquote different enough that we're able to kind of see something about the West in the mirror of them, if that makes sense at all. Like, for instance, like Mishima, I don't have enough, I did a lot of research on it, but I still don't really understand Japanese society and history to have an opinion about whether I agree with him on anything. But I do feel like I understand what he was reacting against and why, and to some degree sympathize with it, right? I mean, who wants to see their entire culture radically change overnight in a completely, puzzling and confusing and unpredictable manner? I mean, I don't know that anybody wants that to happen, even if the goal is something, amazing. It's not particularly habitable for that change to be happening that quickly. Um, and so, yeah, I just kind of wonders, like, is there something, and this is sort of open-ended question, and maybe you don't have an answer for it, and I don't necessarily expect you to, but is there something we learn about the West by looking at guys like this, I guess?
I think certainly so. And I think, what makes anyone a great artist is that they're of their times and are probably interested in their times. Even Tarkovsky said, when he was doing this medieval epic about Rublev, he wanted it to be about thoughts he was having in the moment. It's not a historical picture in the traditional sense of the term.
Mhm.
So, I think what makes someone a great artist is like they are focused on their time, but they get something about people, right? They get something, they're not just a historical artifact. So I think, I reread Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, which is, I
Mhm.
haven't read all of Mishima, but is the favorite of the ones I have read.
Yeah.
And I read it, I guess the character in it is 13. So I couldn't have read it when I was 13, but maybe I read it when I was 19.
Yeah.
But I remember that teenage feeling of, yeah, just hatred of like the adult world. Or he has that line that, fathers are all losers, basically, right? Or like to be
Mhm.
in the position of being a father, whether you're nice or mean or present or absent, is irrelevant because the role of the father is to drag you, out of your truth and into this just corrupt world of like people living in bad faith and just kind of sleepwalking through their lives. And I
Right.
think that, who knows, but maybe Mishima felt that, America or just the kind of new world order was the father in that case, right? It was certainly like the world that Japan was being dragged into forcibly, under extreme duress. Although maybe also willingly after they lost the war, that Japanese society was willing to say, like, well, you know, accept the bargain of becoming a kind of American proxy state if it lets us thrive, which clearly it did, right? Or they were able to thrive, within a generation after the war. And maybe so what Mishima is saying, and I think another thing that we haven't talked about in terms of Mishima yet is that there's this kind of eroticism of surrender. So part of it, there's the idea that Mishima was like a pretend samurai, or was like a Western fantasy of a samurai in a way that embarrassed Japanese people. And I've heard that, once he did his famous, ritual suicide at the government mansion and, with his army and all of that, most of Japanese society was embarrassed. And they were saying, you're making us look bad in the eyes of the world. And you're kind of playing into a stereotype that other people have of us. And we want to be seen as modern and sophisticated. And you're sort of playing out this like infantile samurai fantasy, which yeah, I can understand that. But the idea that surrender itself could be a form of power. I mean, it relates to masochism, it may relate to sexuality, but I think it's just, to bring it back to the Western influence, there's something fascinating about the idea that on the one hand, he's like ultra surrendering by pandering to Western fantasies about Japanese power now that it's impotent, now that one guy with a samurai sword is not a threat the way the whole army was at some point. And actually my father's uncle was killed by the Japanese in the Philippines, so he grew up with a sense of World War II history in that light. And then I spent a summer working in Tokyo for an animator, and my parents came, and it was this sort of like, I don't know, powerful moment that my father finally came to Japan and like kind of released this trauma and tension that he'd had for 60 years or so. And he kind of made his peace with what Japan was now,
Right. Well, I mean, has a country undergone a more radical transformation at, say, in the 20th century than Japan? I mean, I'm not,
no,
I don't think so.
Only Germany in terms of its orientation toward America, but I guess its culture didn't change to the same degree.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. And, it makes me think that bit you're talking about surrender, thinking about Tarkovsky. I was fascinated with an aspect of Tarkovsky's sort of personal ethic. He in the book Sculpting, what is it called? Sculpting in Time, which is sort of his, it's almost like, I don't know if it's a memoir. I mean, it's ostensibly a book about making movies, but it ends up being a book of Tarkovsky's philosophy, an artistic sort of manifesto in a way. He talks about, he has this kind of two-pronged notion of freedom that I find very compelling. And on the one hand, he basically says freedom doesn't have anything to do with what the government or political system or historical context. Freedom is basically, it's an entirely an internal state in which you just decide what you're doing in any given moment. And if you are brave enough to sort of I don't want to say do the thing you want to do, because it's not a hedonistic thing, but if you're sort of brave enough to propel yourself through this desire you have, that's what freedom is. And so it doesn't matter if you're living in the secret police are right outside your door. And then on the other hand, he also says that the notion of artistic freedom is sort of a joke almost, that artists aren't free and actually don't even really want to be free. They're free within their confines of their I don't even know if you would say that. They're bound to the thing that they're working on, right? And so whatever kind of socio-political context of freedom is somewhat irrelevant, because they're going to have to do this thing one way or the other. And it's entailed with its own consequences of either committing to the project or not committing to the project, right? And I guess it kind of goes to that sort of internal interior fascist we were talking about. It's like, does the context of the rest of the world matter all that much when, you've got this thing in your head sort of that's going to, kick your ass if you don't do it, and maybe reward you if you do it.
I've been thinking a lot about that idea of freedom. Yeah, and I think that I would agree with Tarkovsky that, there's the kind of advertised free, like freedom trademark that is like a Pavlovian freedom, which is the freedom to, buy any of a million things on Amazon, or, go on any different vacations, or eat a different restaurant every night, or, the freedom of the kind of like urban middle class in the West today, which is nice. I mean, I wouldn't want to lose that freedom.
No, me neither.
But I think there's a deeper freedom, which is what Tarkovsky's talking about, which is paradoxical, because it's the freedom of total submission to something you chose.
Mhm.
So you could say it's not free if something is imposed on you. You know, if you're
Mhm.
drafted into a war you don't believe in, or if you're in prison or whatever, that's clearly not freedom. But I think it's also not freedom in a really deep sense to have this kind of, you know, what we have in the West of like freedom of consumer choice, of like have it your
Mhm.
way really means have it our way, right?
Right.
Whereas I think, yeah, exactly that. You know, and I studied mysticism in college, and I've always been interested in individuals who completely pledge themselves to something. It could be anything, right? It could be, you know, an athletic pursuit. It could be some kind of profound love to, you know, one person. It could be to this idea of, you know, the nation, of some kind of nationalistic hero. And I think artists, you know, true artists always have that quality, which again, I think relates to like power and submission, or it's a kind of sadomasochistic thing that, like, on the one hand, or speaking for myself at least, I want to feel empowered to say, I'm writing this novel that no one told me to write, and no one can
Mhm.
tell me what to do with it. And this is my place, and I'm, you know, it's 100% my world, and there's no money involved, and there's no, you know, I don't care whose toes I'm stepping on, and all of that. But on
Mhm.
the other hand, there's the masochistic side, which is saying I want to like utterly submit. I want to have my will crushed by the enormity of this calling.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
want to feel like I have no rights at all. I have to do this thing, and I'm shackled to the wheel of this until it's done or it kills me. And I think if you
Yeah.
can do that, then you really feel free. Whereas, you know, you meet people all the time who are intelligent and well-meaning and have, you know, kind of are open-minded and are people who are generally likable, but seem deeply sad because they don't feel like they have a abiding commitment to anything.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. No, I think there's some real truth to that. And I think that's part of the appeal of both of these guys, you know, sort of loosely talking about Mishima and Tarkovsky. You know, there is this element of like, can you, what if you just strapped yourself to the mast, right? Is there a way that you might be able to like, you might be able to escape the sirens of modern life if you could just actually commit to this thing. Um, and Tarkovsky is an interesting case. You know, Mishima had such financial success fairly early in his career. I mean, he was just writing bestseller after bestseller, and for a while there, every book was selling more than the previous book. Not only more than his own previous book, but more than anybody else in the country's book, right? Just huge success. And so that has its own kind of propellant force to it. Tarkovsky financially never had any success. I mean, not only were his films, I mean, his films were somewhat celebrated, but he existed in within a system for the vast majority of his career that major financial incentives kind of weren't even there. And after Andrei Rublev came out, there was a period where he and his wife were sleeping under the kitchen table of his in-laws at his in-laws house because they had literally no money, and the Soviet government was not approving his film project, so he couldn't work. Certainly at some time in there when he was laying under that kitchen table as like a 30-something-year-old man who'd had films appear, had won a film festival in New York and had films appear in, you know, the international festival scene. I'm sure there's a moment in there where he thought, you know, maybe I should just become a mechanic or something, right? Like, or you know what I mean? Like, or I should, you know, go work at the whatever plant, and just give up all of the, what's the point of all of this? And he never did. And it doesn't seem like he ever even formulated any kind of backup plan. Um, and just knowing that story, there's something both inspiring and a little bit vertiginous about that. Like it's like, oh boy, is that how serious you got to be? Because I'm not sure, man, maybe I'm not up to that.
Yeah, there's a
Right?
great story I read on Roger Ebert's site where he would have just little like asides from his life in, you know, in the film world. And he said there's this Serbian director named Dusan Makaviev who
Mm,
might have known Tarkovsky. It was kind of the same time.
mhm,
And he said one year Ebert went to Cannes and Makaviev was the jury president. He was in the penthouse, the, you know, Palais Royal, whatever the big hotel is. And, you
mhm,
know, there were big cocktail parties and all the glamorous people were there. And then the next year, Ebert went back to Cannes and he was walking on the beach. And he said he got to the end of the beach and there was this little tent with like a pair of flip-flops in front. And Roger kind of stopped and looked at it. And as he's looking, the flap unzips and Makapiev comes out. And
Ooh.
Roger looks at him and he's like, Dushan, like, what's going on? Like last year, you were the jury president. Like, what happened? And Makapiev just had a big smile and he said, Roger, you know how it is in this business. 1 year, penthouse, next year, beach.
Right. Right.
But it
Yeah,
does
the
make me
notion.
think about, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just saying the notion that you might have this enduring thing. I mean, there is something I think that is part of the American dream, let's say, for lack of a better term, that is like I'll have the one thing happen to me that I won't have to worry about anything ever again. That somehow through, you'll buy the right magic beans and everything will be taken care of from here on out, and it almost never happens to anybody. Um,
Yeah, it's a kind of like maybe like, I don't know, evangelical fantasy of the idea of making it, right? That you'll get
mm,
through the door and you'll be saved, right? And you'll never have
mm,
to, you'll walk on clouds for the rest of your life. And I
mm,
think that, to go back to the vertiginous idea, I think that's it, that, conditional freedom is exactly that, I'll keep doing this as long as it works out, right? Or as long as the
mm.
next one is better than, sells more than the last, or as long as no one ever criticizes me or something,
Right.
Whereas true freedom, which is kind of insane, right? It is kind of,
Mhm,
that's like Kierkegaard's Night of Faith, is like, I'm going to do this no matter what.
mhm,
No matter how much people mock me, no matter how much, if you want to get really dark, like no matter how much it, harms the people around me, like I'm going to just keep doing it.
mhm,
And there's nothing can stop me, even myself. It's like I'm
mhm,
completely renouncing my will.
mhm.
I
Yeah.
really want to be, call it God or inspiration, whatever you want, but I want that thing to do whatever it wants with me, and it can like break my neck if that's what it wants, right? That's a kind of genuine freedom, because it's like you bet everything you had on whatever you chose, and you didn't revoke it, or you didn't say, well, I'm going to put a few chips on this too, and there's
Right. Right.
right. And I think about that in terms of the question of, is an artist, is it possible to become a hero through art? Which I
Mhm,
think is it maybe existed historically, but in the post World War II era, where I think we feel as though we lived through or we didn't live through it, but we feel as though the last true war is over, right?
mhm,
And now that we have nuclear weapons, we can only have proxy wars or like destroy the world, right? There's not a possibility of having like a genuinely meaningful war
mhm.
that genuinely settles things the way we really settled scores with Germany and Japan, and didn't with Russia, right? I mean, that's part of what
Mhm,
the Berlin Wall book is about. But
mhm,
anyway, the question of whether art can lead to heroism,
mhm,
I've always felt torn between film and literature. So this relates
mhm,
to Tarkovsky and Mishima. That on the one hand, and I encountered both of them probably when I was 19 or 20. So they exist in a similar sort of like canon for me of the moment when I was looking toward what would like the most inspirational adult model of an artist be? What would be like the greatest possible thing to grow into? Right. I think that's how I felt at that time. And I still feel torn. I've always felt torn between those two. Because on the one hand, filmmaking seems more heroic in that if you actually directed something like Andrei Rublev, you're out there with thousands of people and millions of dollars, and you're dealing with all this equipment and
mhm.
weather and geography, and you're making it happen in a way like you really are leading an army into battle.
Oh, the stakes are high
The
every
stakes are
day.
exactly.
Yeah.
You have all those
Yeah.
horses, you have all that,
Hmm.
aerial stuff. And on the one hand, I still feel that. I mean, I watched Andrei Rublev again recently, and there's no way you can not be blown away by what someone achieved to make that.
Hmm.
And yet at the same time, I can also convince myself of the opposite, which is that when you're making a film, you're still in the real world. You're still dealing with things that actually exist. And there might be something deeper about literature in that you're actually conjuring phantasms. You're pulling things
Mm.
out of nowhere that never existed before,
Right.
or
Right.
I guess the words existed, but there's something you're doing with it. This gets back to an earlier question of like, is it just, nonsense, or is it just masturbation to be playing around with words and like making up nice little stories? Or are you tinkering with the code of reality? That's the
Right.
hope, at least. The hope and the fear, right? I think writing is a much more anodyne concept if you think you're just making up nice stuff or just describing what already exists, the way a
Mhm.
social novel might. But if you really believe that you're tinkering with the source code, then that suddenly becomes very exciting and very frightening.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Well, and this makes me think of like uh, you know, you wrote The Berlin Wall, which is, I'm not going to throw it into a genre, but it's, I know you said you want to be a genre, and I, I say this sort of the same thing to myself. You put it so well, in that interview you did, but let's say it has a speculative element at least, right? There is, I feel like a interesting, uh, almost like a cognito hazard that you can get into working with speculative material where like the amount of time you have to spend thinking about it to bring it to fruition, you kind of have to believe it to some extent. Like, tell me if I'm wrong. Like, to write that, in some sense, you have to at least provisionally believe that the Berlin Wall is trying to pull itself back together, right?
Yeah, I view all writing, especially speculative writing, or at least
Mhm,
my experience of doing it,
mhm,
has to feel like you're describing something that actually happened or that
mhm.
actually is happening. Right? It feels totally fake if you know it's a fantasy while you're doing it.
Right,
It's the way
right,
some bands say, I can play the same hit every night, but if I don't feel the emotion of the song, I can't hit the right notes.
right.
Right? You can't phone it in, right? You can't just say like this would be, I bet people would think this is cool. Right? There are a lot of books like that, but you can tell it immediately. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very unimpressive. And I think like the only thing that is impressive is someone going all the way in and then somehow rescuing themselves or then somehow coming out the other side.
Right, right. Because that is a dangerous place in there, right? Because there is this element of like, there's a metaphorical truth to it and a larger significance to it. But if you're going to actually occupy the brain space of it being true at all levels, then you are entering delusional territory, like at least within your own head, at least temporarily.
And it goes back to faith, maybe, of like you have to trust. You don't have to talk about God. You could just say
Hmm.
it's yourself, right? But you have to
Hmm.
trust that yourself or someone will rescue you,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? If you're
Hmm.
like, I'm just gonna dip my toe in because I'm afraid I'll drown if I jump in. It's like, fair enough, but sticking
You're
your
not
toe in
swimming.
it's not swimming. It's not going to go
Yeah.
anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All you can
Yeah.
do is be like, I'm jumping in and where I land is where I land. Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes me kind of wonder about Mishima. I was just so fascinated when we did that episode about this trajectory, and you can see we described it in the show as like you can see the blade coming towards his stomach even when he's a small child, and you can see it sort of finding its way to him throughout his life. But you kind of do wonder, like, at what point, and maybe for him it was very, very early, did he step into um the I guess like the narrative structure that required him to end up where he ended up. Because it feels inevitable in his case that somehow maybe it wasn't going to be on top of that building, and maybe he wasn't going to be a nationally known famous sort of superstar writer, but somehow this act was going to take place. And that short story you mentioned, patriotism, it's sort of like a dry run for what ultimately happened. um and you do kind of wonder, I mean, the simplest way to say it is like, did he sort of write himself into insanity in a certain way, though it may not have felt insane to him? Um, maybe that's one way that this whole the whole artistic life can go seriously awry, you know. Um,
Well, it's like, is that the heroic culmination of, you finally found the courage to do what you were talking about? Or
mhm,
is it the tragedy that you ran out of juice? You ran out of the
mhm,
magic that allowed you to conjure ideas that felt real. And it's sort of, it's
mhm,
ironic that, speaking of his Western facingness and the idea of not wanting to die a famous old man at 80, his mentor Kawabata did win the Nobel like a year or two before Mishima killed himself. And apparently Mishima
mhm.
had also really wanted the Nobel. Yeah. So there's some
Yeah.
sense that
And
who knows what he thought.
he knew that like it wasn't going to come back around to Japan for a generation at least,
Of
the way
course.
those
Yeah.
things work,
There's
right?
only ever been two, I think, right? Of Kawabata and then
And
Kenzaburo
Kenzaburo
Oe.
Oe, yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
Ishiguro if you consider him Japanese. But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think, something I thought about in terms of how images can sometimes pass through the real and then become images again. Right. So in the Berlin Wall, there's this cult, which also is kind of based on Mishima. There's this cult around Anders Breivik, and there's Breivik. They free Breivik from jail and start this kind of like fanatical, like runic Norwegian army to raise Atlantis. But it's based on the idea of Mishima having this private army around him. But I was thinking this relates to what we talked about earlier today, that Breivik was a famous World of Warcraft player in reality, right? And he was like a well-known character who kind of like conquered Europe from, the orcs and the goblins in Warcraft. And then at some point, reached some dividing line where that wasn't enough for him, or he wasn't like saving the ground, the digital ground having been saved by him in his own mind.
Can we back up just one second? Breivik, just like what's the one or two sentence in case that name doesn't mean anything to people.
So yeah, he basically is considered like the worst domestic terrorist in European history, or at least since the war, maybe ever. And so he, became this famous Warcraft player, and then it was insufficient for him, and he mounted this truly insane plan. He was going to like blow up the parliament, which failed, and then he did successfully kill something like 80 kids on an island off of Oslo at a kind of left-wing summer camp, who I guess somehow, I don't know, he thought those kids were helping to allow like foreigners into Norway. But then he was sent to prison, and this kind of just, we'll never be able to believe this. He successfully petitioned the Norwegian government for access to a PS2 and then a PS3 in prison. And at first they would only give him children's games because they thought he shouldn't have violent games. And he even overrode that. He like said that was cruel and unusual punishment. So now he's probably in there today playing Doom or whatever.
Right.
But the thing that it made me think about in terms of Mishima is, on the one hand, Breivik wasn't an artist, but he was someone for whom the virtual was insufficient and it broke through to the real. But then that real just collapsed back into the virtual. Obviously not for those kids who died or for their families, but for the vast majority of people. For him and for most of us, he exists as just a concept.
For us as Americans, it's just a Wikipedia article. Andre Breivik is just a Wikipedia article you might read,
Totally.
Yeah.
And Mishima might be the same, that on the one hand, you could say, doing it in a pretend way, right? Writing books and, and being on the stage and having his pretend army, all of that wasn't enough. And at some point he needed to become a real samurai and really commit seppuku. Right. And he did, in a sense. He did really die. You can, see his head on a plate if you want, right? You can Google that image. And yet that too is now just an image, right? That also became just a thumbnail. So I think that, this gets into like Dante Lillo territory, but the idea of, these acts of extreme violence, at least nowadays in this sort of post, in the nuclear age, also just manifest as images. So I think there's some much more complex relation between like, what does it mean for an idea to suddenly become real? But it's like, then the thing that is real suddenly becomes an idea.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it gets more and more confusing for the average person to navigate as the lines between quote unquote real and virtual get blurrier and blurrier and blurrier. This is totally off topic, but I contemplate a lot of times simulation theory, not about whether or not it's a true theory, but the place it occupies in people's thinking about reality, because there, on the one hand, it's literally just playing Mad Libs with like actual already existing theistic religions. It's really just putting different names on things, right? Programmer instead of whatever. But on the other hand, there's like, well, no, I already know that I live in a simulation because I turn my computer on every morning and I spend most of my time in there. So of course I'm already living in a simulation. And when am I not on the computer? I'm not even sure when I'm not on the computer exactly. Like, it's kind of vague because I could get a message at any moment that I will then respond to and be sucked right back in. So it's not even clear when I'm on it, when I'm off it. I'm kind of half on it, I guess, all of the time, unless I'm, maybe sleeping or something. Yeah. So you can see how something seems real in one place, or seems real enough but not adequate enough, how you would transliterate that into IRL. But then also go back, that Andres Breivik thing is actually fascinating. I had never heard about him petitioning for That's kind of crazy, actually, that he gets to, gets to play whatever video game he wants to all day long.
It's unreal. And the saddest thing is it kind of proves him right. If his whole point is like the Norwegian government has gone soft, it doesn't stand for anything anymore. It's like, well,
Yeah, I mean that. Wow, wow.
It's kind of a
You know,
tragic thought.
it is. It's sort of darkly humorous and ironic in a way. Um, it's like it's the whole terrorist act was just like the ultimate level of whatever meta video game he was playing, right?
Yeah, it's
Um,
and you can say that about simulations, that there's like simulations within simulations, right? Like if we are
mhm.
in a simulation, why do we also make simulations, right? If you feel like your life already is the computer, why are you then also opening the computer?
Right,
But maybe it's
right.
something like that, right? If like you need a microcosm to try to comprehend the larger condition. And that maybe is
Yeah,
like what Andrei Rublev's doing as an icon painter. I don't
that's a
truly
very good
understand
point.
the like orthodox understanding of icons, but I guess it has something to do with like the same way some religions prohibit graven images, and the Orthodox is sort of the opposite, right? That like this image will get you there, right? Or like if you can
Hmm.
conjure an icon with enough meaning, it can help you comprehend what it represents in a way that you couldn't just with your own imagination.
Yeah, I mean I don't understand it very well either, but it's kind of a bit of magic in the formal sense, right? I mean, in that it's a tool that you use for, in another culture we'd call like meditation, I suppose. Um, right, right. Yeah, very interesting. I
And
got
relates
thinking,
to
oh, good.
okay,
No,
but just relates to the idea of commitment too. Like it's the thing that Joseph Campbell said that he's like, I understand world religion and that these things are all versions of each other and there are infinite ways you could try to understand divinity or understand the universe or something. And I can see it from all these perspectives and I'm equally versed in, all these different traditions. But I also am a Christian. And I
mm,
think the reason he said that is he's like, there are many, the inside of like the labyrinth or whatever it is might be the same, but you have to pick a door. You can't be
yeah,
like, I'm going to go through every door at once, right? They may all be
right.
equivalent, but you could pick randomly, right? But you still have to pick one.
Right, right, right. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I like that. Let's kind of close with that. I do want to ask you, just say where people can find you most easily online in the simulation.
In the simulation. So everything is at Ravid Dice,
Okay.
RAVIDDICE. So Twitter, Instagram, or whatever, X,
Yeah.
Instagram, David Leo Rice on Facebook, anything
Okay,
like that.
great.
And my website is raviddice.com.
Okay, and we'll have links to all that. Congratulations on the new book. People out there definitely check this out. David is an extremely talented guy. We're looking forward to more from you. I sort of hate to ask this question, but I'm also very curious. You finished this book in 2018. What's the current project? What's the next thing we're going to see from you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So there's a few things that are in the can that should come out next year. One is volume 3 of my Room in Dodge City trilogy.
Excellent.
So that
Excellent.
trilogy will wrap up.
Cool.
And then the other is a project I've been working on for years on this sort of shifty duo called the Brothers Squimbop. And I've been writing these kind of long short stories, a lot of which came out in the Southwest Review over the past 4 or 5 years. So a big collection of those is going to come out with
Cool.
1111 next year. And sort of all in order, they form a kind of novel, or they're like the saga of this duo, which
Awesome.
connects to my novel Angel House. So it's a kind of meta book, but you could read it as just a standalone collection, and actually deals with a lot of like neo-medievalism and carnivals and pageants and stuff that is in Andrei Rublev, certainly. So that's all done. And then right now, speaking of like creativity and ego and like the punishing father and all of that, I'm working on a sequel to my novel, The New House, which came out a couple years ago. So which is about a son's coming of age as the sort of son of this failed artist couple. And so the sequel, the one I'm doing now, is like the father's perspective on that same story, but it's like a completely different story. And it has something to do with, actually very much related to Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. What are the almost like what's the worst kind of father you could be, and what does that mean?
Okay. No, that's all very exciting, man. I am super impressed by both your talents and just how productive you are. And so, folks out there, get on the David Leo Rice train right now. And
Thank you.
yeah, once again, David, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
All I know is that we can be heroes just for one day.
Just for one day.
I know that
Right.
much.
Right. Speaking of the Berlin Wall, actually. Right?